Hi again then guys, and welcome to episode 45 of GT Masters, and in this particular review we are discussing a car which is kind of like the Scirocco in the last episode, in that it's a vehicle which almost seems to cross over between a couple of categories, and the car is a Lexus, of course. It's the IS200 GT-1. This is one of the most affordable race cars in the game, one which you don't really see used a huge amount, and a car which is kind of strange in the way that it's titled, but then compared with the way that it looks and the way that you'd expect it to be classed. Now visually it looks like a pure touring car, but it's called the GT1 and it runs in an entirely different series to most of the other cars in this particular series. But being as it's not strictly speaking a conventional touring car, we are including it here, although in terms of spec and ability it's very similar to a touring car. Now this car actually kind of reminds me in terms of its livery to a vehicle which was on Gran Turismo 2, but it wasn't included on the game after that, and that car was the Mitsubishi FTO race car. I believe it was called the Tavon Trampion FTO, and it was blue and white with blue splatters of paint all over it, and that was actually one of my favourite race cars back then. This car visually kind of reminds me of that, but with red paint splattered on it instead of blue, in effect. Now the engine's a 2 litre. You can turbocharge it up to, as I said, what you'd expect from a touring car kind of level, 494 horsepower, 300 foot-pounds of torque, and it's pretty light. In fact, it's actually a lot lighter than many of the GT cars in a conventional sense. In this series, it only weighs 1,010 kilos, so that's lighter than a Zonda R, that's lighter than all of the GT3 machines, that's lighter than the FXX. It's pretty impressive, to say the least, how lightweight this car is. It puts out 489 horsepower per tonne and sits at a maximum PP of 544, which is one of the lowest of this series, but at the same time isn't surprising given that the spec isn't overly strong. The weight is good, but that's pretty much it. The power and torque aren't particularly high, the engine isn't particularly large, the horsepower per tonne isn't particularly high, so the fact that the PP is at 544 is not surprising, really. Now 544 PP in the case of this car may actually be a little bit too high to race it at, because 494 horsepower is certainly enough to get the job done in a road car, but in a vehicle like this running so much downforce, it really hinders the straight line performance. The top end performance on this car is no way near most of the other cars in this series, which is why it seems kind of a shame to compare it to them rather than vehicles which it would be more appropriate to race it against, such as the Mazda 6 touring car. Even the Toyota Altezza touring car are much better rivals than many of the other cars in GT Masters, but that's the way it is. Now one of the best things about this car, apart from the low weight and the good handling, but we'll get into that more in just a second, is actually the price. As I mentioned just now, it is one of the most affordable race cars here, and a couple of them are similar prices. The Suzuki Cappuccino race car is a similar price, the Lotus Elises are a little bit more, but are still in that same kind of ballpark figure. At 100 grand, it's actually pretty good for a race car. It's one of the most affordable race cars in the game, not quite as cheap though as what is arguably its main rival, which I mentioned just now, the Toyota Altezza touring car, and overall that car is definitely a stronger vehicle. But that will not be reviewed in this series, that's going to be in a forthcoming touring car series. So overall the question for this car is, should you buy it? And if so, what's it good for? Well, overall there are some vehicles which, and I try to be positive about all vehicles, because as I've said before on the channel, every car is good for something. Some though are of course better at certain things than others. Some vehicles though just aren't strong enough in their respective category. They're not bad cars, that doesn't make them bad. It just means that they're quite simply not as quick as any of their rivals, or at least most of their rivals. And sometimes that purely falls down to the fact that not enough of their natural rivals are included. Vehicles like the Lotus Elises, the racing muscle cars, the Cappuccino race car, they're good cars in their own right, but their field of competition is so narrow that there really just isn't enough to put them up against apart from one-make racing or racing them against road cars, which doesn't really seem fair, and most lobbies probably won't allow it. This particular car unfortunately falls into, at least to some degree, that same category. It's not a bad car. The handling is actually outstandingly good. It's extremely beginner friendly. There is a huge amount of grip, and you can pretty much do whatever you want with the handling. You can throw it through corners, you can brake early, brake late, give it full throttle without really worrying about the tail stepping out too much. It's an excellent handling car, and I would actually say that the best thing about this car overall, given that the handling, weight and price are all good points, is that this is the kind of car that I would recommend to someone if they are completely inexperienced when it comes to driving, or specifically racing, competition vehicles, and if you're looking for a vehicle to drive to teach yourself or learn through experience how to drive a race car properly. This car is a good learner vehicle. It's not designed to be, but it works out to be. It has the perfect amount of power to learn with and to be quick, but not so much that it's impossible to drive or to learn for somebody who has no experience. So if you feel like brushing up your skills with a race car and getting quicker laps out of something that doesn't just give all the power to you served on a platter, then definitely use this car. But in racing situations, the vast majority of them at least, it's just not a quick enough vehicle to genuinely take on most other race cars or touring cars. It can take on some, just not many. So if you do buy the car, be aware of that. But overall, that's it for this particular episode. I'll see you guys next time, and as always, thanks for watching.